Tulip Mania, the world's first economic bubble. In the winter of 1637, in the prosperous Dutch Republic, a single flower bulb changed hands for a price that could buy a luxurious house on Amsterdam's most fashionable canal. This was no ordinary flower. It was a Semper Augustus tulip, with its distinctive flame-like red streaks on white petals, so rare that only a dozen may have existed in the world. Even more remarkably, this transaction wasn't unusual. Throughout the Netherlands, people from all walks of life were trading their homes, land, livestock, and life savings for tulip bulbs, flowers that wouldn't bloom for months. This was Tulip Mania, the world's first recorded economic bubble, a cautionary tale of greed, speculation, and financial folly that continues to fascinate us nearly 4 centuries later. For a brief, extraordinary moment in history, a humble flower became more valuable than gold, driving rational people to irrational extremes in pursuit of floral fortune. And then, almost as suddenly as it began, the market collapsed, leaving financial ruin in its wake. But the true story of Tulip Mania is more nuanced and revealing than the simple morality tale often told. It's a story of human psychology, of innovation and globalization in the early modern world, of art and beauty intersecting with commerce. It offers us a mirror to our own economic manias, from the South Sea bubble to the dot-com boom to cryptocurrency speculation. Join us as we journey back to 17th century Holland to unravel the fascinating phenomenon of Tulip Mania, where flowers bloomed, fortunes withered, and economic history was forever changed. Historical context: the Netherlands in the 17th century. To understand how a flower could captivate an entire nation, we must first understand the extraordinary time and place in which Tulip Mania occurred. The early 17th century Netherlands was experiencing what historians would later call the Dutch Golden Age, a period of unprecedented prosperity, cultural flowering, and global influence that transformed a small, waterlogged corner of Europe into the world's most advanced economy. The Dutch Republic had only recently emerged as an independent nation. After decades of bloody struggle against Spanish rule in the 80 Years' War, the northern provinces had effectively secured their independence by 1609, though formal recognition wouldn't come until 1648. This hard-won freedom created a unique political environment, a republic in an age of monarchies, with a decentralized government that gave considerable autonomy to individual cities and provinces. What made the Netherlands truly exceptional was its economic dynamism. Despite limited natural resources and a relatively small population of about 2 million people, the Dutch created a commercial empire that spanned the globe. Amsterdam replaced Antwerp as Europe's financial and trading capital. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the world's first multinational corporation and the first company to issue public stock. Dutch ships dominated global trade routes, bringing spices from Indonesia, sugar from the Caribbean, and luxury goods from across Asia. This explosion of wealth transformed Dutch society. A prosperous middle class emerged. Merchants, shipowners, manufacturers, and professionals who built elegant canal houses and patronized the arts. Unlike other European societies with rigid aristocratic hierarchies, the Netherlands offered unusual social mobility. A successful merchant could rise to prominence through commercial acumen rather than noble birth. This created a culture that valued entrepreneurship, innovation, and calculated risk-taking. The Dutch Golden Age was also a time of remarkable cultural and intellectual achievement. This was the era of Rembrandt and Vermeer, whose paintings captured the prosperity and character of Dutch society. It was a golden age of science, with figures like Anton van Leeuwenhoek pioneering microscopy and Christian Huygens making breakthroughs in astronomy and physics. The University of Leiden became a center of learning where ideas could be debated with relative freedom. Religious tolerance, though limited by modern standards, was another distinctive feature of Dutch society. While the Dutch Reformed Church was dominant, Catholics, Jews, and various Protestant denominations were generally allowed to worship privately. This tolerance attracted religious refugees from across Europe, including Sephardic Jews from Portugal and Huguenots from France, who brought valuable commercial networks and skills. Yet amid this prosperity, Dutch society faced significant challenges. The ongoing war with Spain was costly. Plague outbreaks periodically ravaged cities. Amsterdam lost about a fifth of its population to plague in 1635 to 1636, just as Tulip Mania was gathering momentum. The wealth gap between rich and poor remained stark, with many ordinary Dutch people living in precarious circumstances despite the nation's overall prosperity. It was in this complex environment, prosperous yet anxious, innovative yet traditional, commercial yet artistic, that the humble tulip would become the focus of extraordinary financial speculation. The Dutch had created a society uniquely receptive to new commercial opportunities, with the capital and confidence to invest in the exotic and the beautiful. When tulips arrived on their shores, they found fertile ground in more ways than one. The tulip's journey, from Ottoman gardens to Dutch soil. The tulip, now so deeply associated with the Netherlands, is not native to Dutch soil. Its journey to Europe is a fascinating tale of exploration, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that spans continents and centuries. The story begins not in the flat polders of Holland, but in the rugged landscapes of Central Asia. Wild tulips originated in the mountainous regions stretching from Central Asia to the Caucasus, where dozens of species grew naturally in the harsh continental climate. The name tulip itself offers a clue to its origins. It likely derives from the Persian word dulband or Turkish tulbin, referring to the turban-like shape of the flower. These wild tulips were smaller and less showy than their modern descendants, but they already possessed the distinctive cup-shaped bloom that would later captivate European imaginations. It was the Ottoman Turks who first cultivated tulips as garden flowers, beginning around 1000 CE. As the Ottoman Empire expanded, so did their passion for tulips. By the 16th century, the flower had become a cultural obsession in Constantinople, modern Istanbul. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, was particularly enamored with tulips, establishing extensive palace gardens filled with thousands of bulbs. The flower became a symbol of wealth and power, featured prominently in Ottoman art, poetry, and decorative objects. The exact moment when tulips first arrived in Western Europe remains somewhat mysterious. The most commonly accepted account credits Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, ambassador of the Habsburg Empire to the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. During his diplomatic mission from 1554 to 1562, Busbecq was reportedly captivated by the tulips he saw in Ottoman gardens. In letters written during this period, he described these strange and beautiful flowers, and either he or his associates are believed to have sent bulbs or seeds back to Vienna. From Vienna, tulips began their spread across Europe. They reached Augsburg, Germany, where they bloomed in a botanical garden in April 1559, recorded as Tulipa turcarum, Turkish tulip. The influential Swiss naturalist Konrad Gessner saw tulips blooming in Augsburg that year and published the first European illustration of the flower in 1561. This scientific documentation helped spark interest among European botanists and garden enthusiasts. The tulip's journey to the Netherlands likely occurred in the 1570s or 1580s. Carolus Clusius, a pioneering botanist and director of the Hortus Botanicus in Leiden, played a crucial role in this transfer. Previously based in Vienna, where he had access to Turkish tulips, Clusius brought bulbs with him when he accepted his position in Leiden in 1593. He planted these exotic specimens in the university's botanical garden, establishing what would become the center of tulip cultivation in Northern Europe. Clusius was a scientist, not a merchant, and he was initially reluctant to share his precious tulip bulbs. Historical accounts suggest that some of his bulbs were stolen from the garden, helping to spread tulip cultivation beyond academic circles. Whether through theft or legitimate trade, tulips soon escaped the confines of the botanical garden and began to appear in the private gardens of wealthy Dutch citizens. What made tulips particularly appealing to the Dutch was not just their exotic origins or striking beauty, but also their perfect adaptation to the Netherlands' growing conditions. The sandy soil behind the coastal dunes proved ideal for tulip cultivation, while the Dutch climate, with its cool springs and not too severe winters, allowed the bulbs to thrive. Within decades of their arrival, the Netherlands had become the undisputed center of tulip cultivation in Europe, developing expertise that would eventually transform a foreign flower into a national symbol. Dutch Golden Age, prosperity and tulip fever. By the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic had emerged as the most commercially advanced nation in Europe. This small country, much of it reclaimed from the sea through ingenious engineering, had transformed itself into a global trading powerhouse. Amsterdam's harbor bustled with ships arriving from and departing to all corners of the known world. The city's canals, newly constructed in a planned expansion, were lined with the elegant homes of prosperous merchants. This prosperity created the perfect conditions for Tulip Mania to take root. The Dutch merchant class had disposable income to spend on luxury goods and status symbols. Gardens became an important way to display wealth and taste, with exotic plants particularly prized. The tulip, with its bright colors and unusual patterns, perfectly suited this desire for the rare and beautiful. Initially, tulips were exclusively the domain of the wealthy. A single bulb of a particularly desirable variety might cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year. What made certain tulips especially valuable was a phenomenon that neither buyers nor sellers fully understood at the time. Some tulips exhibited spectacular color patterns, flamed or feathered streaks on their petals, that made them far more desirable than solid-colored varieties. We now know these patterns were caused by a virus spread by aphids, but in the 17th century, this breaking of the tulip's color was mysterious and unpredictable. A plain tulip might suddenly transform into a valuable variegated specimen, or a prized variegated tulip might produce offspring with solid colors. This unpredictability added an element of speculation to tulip collecting. Buyers weren't just purchasing a beautiful flower. They were investing in potential future value if the bulb produced the coveted variegated blooms. The most famous of these broken tulips was the Semper Augustus, with its dramatic red flames on white petals. At the height of Tulip Mania, only a dozen Semper Augustus bulbs may have existed, making them the most valuable tulips in the world. The Dutch approach to commerce also facilitated the tulip trade's expansion. The Netherlands had Europe's most sophisticated financial sector, with innovations like the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, and the Bank of Amsterdam, 1609. The Dutch were familiar with complex contracts, futures trading, and financial speculation. These commercial tools would soon be applied to the tulip market with unprecedented results. Another factor that contributed to Tulip Mania was the flower's natural growth cycle. Tulip bulbs can only be uprooted and moved during the summer months when they're dormant. For the rest of the year, they must remain in the ground. This created a situation where tulips were often bought and sold without physically changing hands. Transactions were based on contracts for future delivery. This separation of ownership from physical possession made it easier for prices to become detached from the intrinsic value of the bulbs. By the 1620s, professional tulip growers had emerged, developing specialized knowledge and techniques. They created detailed catalogs showing the various tulip varieties, often with hand-colored illustrations. These catalogs circulated among potential buyers, stoking desire for the most beautiful and rare specimens. Tulips were given evocative names that enhanced their appeal: Admiral van Enkhuizen, General Bull, Viceroy, and other names suggesting nobility and prestige. As the 1630s began, what had been an expensive hobby for the wealthy was about to transform into something unprecedented. A speculative frenzy that would draw in people from all levels of Dutch society and create the world's first documented economic bubble. The speculation begins from hobby to mania. The transformation of tulips from expensive collector's items to objects of mass speculation didn't happen overnight. Throughout the 1620s and early 1630s, tulip prices rose steadily but not spectacularly. The market remained primarily in the hands of genuine enthusiasts, wealthy merchants, aristocrats, and serious horticulturists who valued the flowers for their beauty and rarity. But around 1634, something changed. Tulip prices began to climb more rapidly, and a new type of buyer entered the market. What triggered this shift remains debated by historians. Some point to a general increase in prosperity after the Dutch Republic renewed its truce with Spain in 1630. Others note that a deadly outbreak of bubonic plague in 1635 to 1636, which killed thousands in Amsterdam alone, may have created a live-for-today mentality among survivors, who were suddenly more willing to take financial risks. Whatever the cause, by 1635, tulip trading had expanded beyond the wealthy elite to include merchants of more modest means, skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and even some farmers and laborers. The mechanics of the tulip trade facilitated its expansion. Since tulip bulbs could only be uprooted and physically transferred during the summer dormant season, most trading occurred through contracts for future delivery. These contracts began to change hands multiple times before the delivery date, with each new buyer hoping to sell at a higher price before having to take possession of the actual bulbs. This form of trading, known as wind trade, because no physical goods changed hands, allowed people to participate with little initial capital. By 1636, formal infrastructure had developed to support the growing trade. In taverns and private homes across the Netherlands, groups called colleges formed where tulip trading took place. These were not educational institutions, but something closer to informal futures exchanges. Each college had its own rules and customs, but typically a trade would be sealed with a small payment, wine money, or wijngeld. That was a fraction of the contract's value. The remainder would be due when the bulbs were delivered months later. The colleges used a fascinating auction system called per AAS, by the ace. A starting price would be set, and then the price would decline until someone agreed to buy. If no one purchased at the minimum price, the seller would add more bulbs to sweeten the deal until a buyer emerged. This Dutch auction system, still used in the Netherlands today for agricultural products, created a sense of urgency and competition among buyers. As trading intensified, the focus shifted increasingly from the tulips themselves to the potential profits from reselling contracts. Many new participants had little knowledge of or interest in horticulture. They couldn't distinguish between varieties and never intended to plant the bulbs they were purchasing on paper. Some traders reportedly didn't even know what a tulip looked like. What mattered was the rising market and the opportunity for quick profits. The speculation began to feed on itself. As prices rose, more people were drawn into the market, pushing prices even higher. Success stories circulated widely. Tales of ordinary people making extraordinary profits in a matter of weeks or even days. One often repeated anecdote tells of a sailor who mistakenly ate an expensive tulip bulb, thinking it was an onion, resulting in a loss equivalent to the cost of feeding a crew for months. Whether true or apocryphal, such stories reinforced the perception of tulips as items of tremendous value. By late 1636, the market had reached a fever pitch. Prices for some varieties had increased 20-fold or more within a single year. Ordinary people were mortgaging their homes and businesses to raise capital for tulip speculation. The stage was set for the most dramatic phase of Tulip Mania, a period of explosive price growth that would make the tulip, briefly, one of the most valuable commodities on Earth. Peak Mania, winter 1636 to 1637. The winter of 1636 to 1637 marked the most extraordinary phase of Tulip Mania. Between December 1636 and February 1637, tulip prices soared to heights that seem almost unbelievable to modern observers. The market had moved beyond mere enthusiasm into a realm of irrational exuberance that would later define the very concept of a financial bubble. During these few frenzied weeks, the prices of common tulip varieties increased by as much as 1,000%. But it was the rare, virus-infected, broken tulips with their spectacular flame patterns that reached truly astronomical values. The Viceroy tulip, with its feathered red and white petals, reportedly sold for the equivalent of 24 tons of wheat or enough to feed a family for half a lifetime. A single Semper Augustus bulb, the most coveted variety, changed hands for 5,000 florins at a time when a skilled craftsman might earn 150 florins a year. One transaction reportedly involved exchanging a single bulb for a collection of goods that included 2 lasts of wheat, for lasts of rye, for fat oxen, 8 fat swine, 12 fat sheep, 2 hogsheads of wine, for tons of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a bed, some clothing, and a silver drinking cup. The trading itself took on a frantic quality. The tavern-based colleges, where tulip contracts were bought and sold, became scenes of increasingly desperate speculation. Traders would gather daily, fueled by alcohol and rumors of massive profits being made elsewhere. Contemporary accounts describe ordinary citizens, weavers, bakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters, abandoning their trades to pursue tulip trading full-time. One observer wrote that the rage among the Dutch to possess tulips was so great that the ordinary industry of the country was neglected, and the population, even to its lowest dregs, embarked in the tulip trade. What made this period particularly remarkable was how the mania spread beyond the major cities into smaller towns and rural areas. Tulip trading, once concentrated in Amsterdam, Haarlem, and other urban centers, now occurred throughout the Netherlands. In some smaller communities, local taverns established their own informal exchanges where farmers and villagers could participate in the tulip trade. The nature of the market had fundamentally changed. In the early years of tulip collecting, buyers were horticulturists who valued the flowers themselves. Now, few traders had any intention of actually planting the bulbs they purchased. The market had become almost entirely speculative, with bulbs changing hands up to 10 times in a single day without ever leaving the ground. Many contracts were essentially wagers on future price movements rather than transactions for actual goods. This disconnect between the tulip's intrinsic value as a flower and its market price as a speculative asset created an inherently unstable situation. Prices had reached levels that could only be justified by the expectation of finding a greater fool willing to pay even more. As one contemporary pamphlet noted, people were buying what they would never receive and selling what they had never owned. The Dutch authorities viewed these developments with growing concern. Religious leaders denounced the tulip trade as a form of gambling and warned of divine punishment for such excesses. Some towns and cities attempted to regulate or even ban tulip trading, but these efforts had little effect on the nationwide frenzy. The market had developed its own momentum that seemed unstoppable. By early February 1637, tulip prices had reached their zenith. A single bulb of some varieties could purchase a grand canal house in Amsterdam's most fashionable district. The question was no longer whether prices would continue to rise, but how high they could possibly go. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would send shockwaves through Dutch society. The crash. When the bubble burst. On February 3, 1637, something remarkable happened in the Dutch town of Haarlem. For the first time in months, a tulip auction ended with no buyers. The tulips offered for sale, previously considered desirable investments, suddenly found no takers even at reduced prices. This seemingly minor event triggered a chain reaction that would bring the entire tulip market crashing down with astonishing speed. News of the failed auction spread rapidly throughout the Netherlands. In taverns and trading colleges across the country, tulip traders began to realize that the ever-rising prices they had come to expect might not continue after all. This created the first seeds of doubt in a market built entirely on confidence. If prices could stop rising, they could also fall, and anyone holding contracts when they did would face financial ruin. The initial response was denial. Many traders convinced themselves that this was a temporary setback, perhaps due to bad weather or local circumstances in Haarlem. But within days, similar reports came from Amsterdam, Utrecht, and other trading centers. Buyers were becoming scarce, and some were backing out of previously agreed deals. The market didn't experience a gradual decline, it simply collapsed. By the second week of February, panic had set in. Traders who had purchased tulip contracts at peak prices now desperately tried to sell them, accepting any offer rather than risk being left with worthless paper when delivery time came in the spring. But as more sellers entered the market, prices plummeted further, creating a vicious cycle. Within a matter of weeks, prices had fallen by 99% or more for many varieties. Tulips that had traded for thousands of florins in January could barely fetch 10 florins by March. The social impact was immediate and severe. Those who had invested heavily in tulips, often borrowing money or mortgaging property to do so, faced financial devastation. Contemporary accounts describe merchants who had been wealthy on paper suddenly finding themselves destitute. One story tells of a man who, upon hearing that his tulip investment had become worthless, drowned himself in a canal. While such extreme cases may be apocryphal, they reflect the genuine distress that rippled through Dutch society. The collapse created a crisis of contracts. Thousands of people had signed legally binding agreements to purchase tulips at prices that now seemed absurdly high. As delivery dates approached in the spring and summer of 1637, buyers simply refused to honor these commitments, arguing that they had been caught up in a form of madness and that the contracts were essentially gambling debts, which were not enforceable under Dutch law. Sellers, meanwhile, insisted that a contract was a contract, regardless of market conditions. They demanded payment in full or significant compensation. The dispute quickly overwhelmed the Dutch legal system. Courts were flooded with lawsuits as parties sought to enforce or escape their tulip contracts. Local authorities found themselves unable to resolve the crisis through normal legal channels. The situation became so dire that it required intervention at the highest levels. In April 1637, the Dutch authorities stepped in with an unprecedented proposal. Representatives from the major cities met in Amsterdam and declared that all tulip contracts signed after November 1636 could be cancelled by buyers upon payment of a small percentage, 3.5%, of the original contract price. This was essentially a government-sanctioned default that favored buyers over sellers. Even with this intervention, the economic damage was substantial. While the tulip trade itself was not large enough to cause a general economic collapse in the Netherlands, many individuals and families suffered severe financial losses. The ripple effects touched various sectors of the economy, from luxury goods to real estate, as those who had lost money in tulips were forced to curtail their spending or sell assets. Aftermath, reckoning, and recovery. In the wake of the tulip market's collapse, Dutch society faced a complex reckoning. The immediate aftermath was characterized by confusion, recrimination, and attempts to assign blame. Pamphlets and broadsheets circulated throughout the Netherlands, alternately mocking the foolishness of tulip speculators and condemning the greed of tulip sellers. Satirical artworks appeared, depicting tulip traders as monkeys or fools, their human faces replaced with flowers. These satirical works served both as entertainment and as moral instruction, warning of the dangers of unchecked greed. The legal aftermath dragged on for years. Despite the government's attempt to create a standardized settlement, many cases still went to court as parties disputed the specific terms of their contracts or claimed special circumstances. The Dutch legal system, known for its commercial sophistication, struggled to categorize tulip contracts. Were they legitimate commercial agreements for future delivery of goods? Or were they more akin to gambling wagers which courts typically refused to enforce? Different jurisdictions reached different conclusions, creating a patchwork of legal precedents. For many individuals, the financial consequences were severe but not catastrophic. Those who had speculated with their entire fortunes faced genuine hardship, but they represented a minority of traders. Most participants had diversified investments and could absorb their tulip losses, painful though they might be. The Dutch economy as a whole proved remarkably resilient. Unlike later financial bubbles that would trigger general economic crises, Tulip Mania remained largely contained within its specific market. The psychological impact, however, was profound and lasting. The Dutch, who prided themselves on their commercial acumen and level-headedness, had succumbed to a collective delusion. This challenged their self-image and prompted soul-searching about the proper relationship between commerce and morality. Religious leaders seized on the tulip crash as evidence of divine displeasure with worldly excess, calling for a return to the Protestant virtues of moderation and thrift. Tulips themselves underwent a remarkable transformation in Dutch culture. From objects of frenzied speculation, they returned to being appreciated primarily for their beauty. The tulip trade continued, but on a much more modest scale and with more realistic pricing. Professional growers, many of whom had maintained a skeptical distance from the worst excesses of the mania, resumed their patient work of developing new varieties and improving cultivation techniques. By the 1640s, the Netherlands had largely moved on from the tulip crisis. The Dutch Golden Age continued, with the country's commercial and cultural achievements undiminished. If anything, the experience of tulip mania may have inoculated Dutch society against similar speculative excesses, at least for a time. The Dutch became more cautious about novel investment opportunities and more skeptical of get-rich-quick schemes. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was educational. The tulip crash became a cautionary tale, repeated from generation to generation as a warning about the dangers of speculative manias. Parents would tell their children about the time when sensible Dutchmen had traded houses for flowers, hoping to instill financial prudence. This oral tradition helped ensure that the lessons of tulip mania would not be forgotten, even as the direct participants passed from the scene. For historians and economists, the aftermath of Tulip Mania raised fundamental questions about market behavior and human psychology that continue to resonate today. How could a society known for its commercial sophistication succumb to such an obvious delusion? What triggers the transition from rational investment to irrational speculation? And perhaps most importantly, how can similar manias be recognized and contained before they cause widespread harm? These questions would be asked again and again as new bubbles emerged in different times and places. Legacy and cultural impact echoes through history. Though it lasted only a few months, Tulip Mania left an indelible mark on economic history, popular culture, and our understanding of financial markets. Its legacy extends far beyond the Netherlands and the 17th century, offering insights and cautionary lessons that remain relevant in our modern world. Tulip Mania's most immediate legacy was establishing the template for future financial bubbles. It contained all the classic elements: an initial period of justified price appreciation based on genuine value, followed by speculative excess disconnected from intrinsic worth, culminating in a sudden collapse when confidence evaporated. This pattern would repeat throughout history: in the South Sea Bubble of 1720, the railway mania of the 1840s, the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, and the housing bubble of the early 2000s. Each of these events, despite occurring in different centuries and involving different assets, followed remarkably similar psychological and economic patterns. For economists and financial theorists, Tulip Mania became a foundational case study in market behavior. The term bubble itself, used to describe an asset whose price far exceeds its intrinsic value, entered the financial lexicon largely because of Tulip Mania. When economists and financial journalists today warn of tulip-like speculation or compare a hot market to Dutch tulips, they're drawing a direct line to those few frenzied months in 1636 to 1637. The story of Tulip Mania gained widespread recognition largely through Charles Mackay's 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Mackay's vivid account, which modern historians consider somewhat exaggerated, painted the episode as a textbook example of collective irrationality. His description of people trading thousands of florins for a single bulb and then facing ruin when the market collapsed captured the public imagination and ensured that Tulip Mania would be remembered as the archetype of financial folly. In Dutch culture, the relationship with this historical episode is complex and evolving. For centuries, Tulip Mania was remembered primarily as a national embarrassment, a moment when Dutch pragmatism gave way to irrational exuberance. More recently, however, it has been embraced as part of the Netherlands' rich commercial and horticultural heritage. Modern Dutch tulip growers and exporters often reference the tulip's extraordinary history as part of their marketing, turning a historical bubble into a selling point for their contemporary products. The tulip itself, of course, survived its brief moment as a financial instrument to become one of the world's most beloved flowers. The Netherlands remains the global center of tulip cultivation, producing billions of bulbs annually and exporting them to every continent. The Keukenhof Gardens near Lies, with their spectacular displays of millions of tulips each spring, attract visitors from around the world. What began as an exotic import from the Ottoman Empire has become an integral part of Dutch national identity. Artists and writers have found endless inspiration in the Tulip Mania story. Novels like Deborah Magaka's Tulip Fever, later adapted into a film, use the bubble as a backdrop for exploring human greed, passion, and folly. Painters continue to create still lives featuring tulips, often with subtle references to their once astronomical value. The visual motif of the tulip appears in everything from Dutch tourist souvenirs to high fashion, carrying with it echoes of its extraordinary history. Perhaps most significantly, Tulip Mania has become a powerful metaphor for the recurring human tendency toward irrational exuberance in financial markets. When Bitcoin prices soared in 2017, countless articles compared the cryptocurrency boom to tulips. When NFTs, non-fungible tokens, commanded millions of dollars in 2021, the tulip comparisons emerged again. The flower that once captivated 17th century Dutch traders has become shorthand for any market that appears to have lost touch with fundamental value. Yet modern scholarship has also brought nuance to our understanding of Tulip Mania. Historians like in Goldgar have challenged the traditional narrative, suggesting that while speculation certainly occurred, the extent and impact of the bubble may have been exaggerated in popular accounts. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere between the myth of universal madness and the revisionist minimization of the event's significance. Conclusion: flowers and folly. The story of Tulip Mania offers us a mirror, not just to the past, but to our own human nature. In those few frenzied months during the winter of 1636 to 1637, we see reflected our capacity for both rational commerce and irrational exuberance, our appreciation for beauty and our susceptibility to greed, our talent for innovation and our vulnerability to self-deception. What makes this historical episode so enduring is not just its colorful details, the astronomical prices, the frantic trading, the sudden collapse, but the universal human behaviors it reveals. The tulip traders of 17th-century Holland were not fundamentally different from modern investors. They were rational actors making what seemed like reasonable decisions based on the information and social cues available to them. Each individual step toward the bubble made sense within its context. It was only the collective outcome that appears irrational in retrospect. This perspective helps us understand why financial bubbles continue to occur despite our knowledge of past episodes. Each generation convinces itself that this time is different, that new technologies, new financial instruments, or new economic conditions have changed the fundamental rules. The Dutch traders believed that rare tulips would always command premium prices because of their beauty and scarcity. Internet investors in the 1990s believed that traditional metrics like profit no longer mattered in the new digital economy. Mortgage speculators in the early 2000s believed that housing prices could only go up. In each case, a kernel of truth supported a mountain of speculation. Yet the Tulip Mania story is not simply a tale of folly. It also speaks to the remarkable resilience of markets and societies. The Dutch Republic absorbed the shock of the tulip crash and continued its trajectory as the most advanced economy of its era. Individual traders learned painful but valuable lessons about risk and speculation. The tulip itself transitioned from an object of financial mania to a beloved cultural symbol and successful agricultural export. What could have been merely a cautionary tale of excess became instead a complex story of adaptation and renewal. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Tulip Mania is how it demonstrates the inseparable connection between economics and human psychology. Markets are not abstract mechanisms operating according to perfect mathematical logic. They are human institutions, subject to all our cognitive biases, social influences, and emotional reactions. The prices of tulips in 1637 reflected not just their horticultural value but the dreams, fears, and social aspirations of the people trading them. As we face our own economic challenges and opportunities in the 21st century, the lessons of Tulip Mania remain relevant. They remind us to question when prices seem detached from fundamental value, to be wary of investment narratives that promise easy wealth, and to recognize the powerful role of social contagion in financial decisions. But they also remind us that even after the most spectacular bubbles, life goes on. Markets recover, lessons are learned, and beauty, like that of the tulip itself, endures beyond the temporary distortions of finance. In the fields of the Netherlands today, millions of tulips still bloom each spring, their cups raised to the sun in a riot of colors that would have delighted the 17th century collectors. They are simultaneously ordinary flowers and extraordinary living artifacts of one of history's most fascinating economic episodes. In their elegant simplicity, they remind us that after all the speculation is over, after all the contracts have been settled or abandoned, after all the fortunes have been made and lost, what remains is what was there at the beginning. The simple, irreducible beauty of a flower that captivated human hearts long before it captured human wallets, and continues to do so long after the mania has passed into history.